The morning of January 12, 1825, greeted the English countryside with relentless cold. Eleanor Hartwell pulled her worn wool cloak tighter as she navigated the narrow path along the River Severn, her boots crunching against the frost-hardened earth. The landscape stretched before her in muted greys and whites. Bare oak trees stood like sentinels, their branches glazed with ice. While the distant hills disappeared into a blanket of fog, she carried a wicker basket filled with medicinal herbs destined for Mrs. Pemberton's apothecary in the village, a journey she had made countless times. The river flowed dark and menacing beside her, its surface partially frozen along the edges where jagged sheets of ice clung to the banks. Eleanor's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she quickened her pace, eager to reach the stone bridge ahead. The path narrowed considerably where erosion had claimed portions of the trail, forcing her to walk perilously close to the water's edge. She stepped carefully, her eyes fixed on the treacherous ground. Alexander Thornbury, Duke of Ravenshire, rode his chestnut mare along the upper ridge, surveying the estate lands that had belonged to his family for generations. At 28, he carried the weight of his title with practiced composure, though the isolation of his position often felt suffocating. His dark coat was tailored perfectly, his gloves of the finest leather, yet even wealth could not shield him from the biting wind that swept across the open fields. He guided his horse downward toward the river path, intending to inspect the tenant cottages before returning to Ravenshire Manor for afternoon correspondence. As Alexander descended the slope, movement below caught his attention. A figure in a dark cloak moved along the riverside path, their progress steady but cautious. He watched absently, his thoughts drifting to the upcoming season in London and the expectations that awaited him there. His mother had already begun her campaign to secure a suitable match, parading eligible young ladies before him at every opportunity. Each was accomplished, well-bred, and entirely predictable. Eleanor's foot found a patch of black ice hidden beneath a dusting of snow. The world tilted violently. Her arms flailed as she fought for balance, the basket flying from her grasp and scattering dried lavender across the frozen ground. She felt herself falling backward, her scream caught in her throat as the icy water rushed up to meet her. The cold was absolute, stealing the breath from her lungs in an instant. Eleanor plunged beneath the surface, the current immediately grasping at her heavy skirts and pulling her deeper. Panic flooded her senses as she kicked upward, breaking the surface long enough to gasp, before the weight of her sodden clothing dragged her under again. The cold penetrated to her bones, her limbs already growing sluggish and unresponsive. She thrashed desperately, her fingers scraping against the underside of an ice shelf. Alexander saw her fall. Without conscious thought, he spurred his horse forward, urging the mare down the steep embankment at a reckless speed. He reached the water's edge in seconds, abandoning his mount and stripping off his heavy coat as he ran. The woman's head broke the surface 10 feet from shore, her face pale with terror, her mouth opening in a silent plea before she disappeared again beneath the dark water. He did not hesitate. Alexander plunged into the river, the cold striking him like a physical blow. His muscles seized momentarily, but he forced himself forward, swimming toward where he had last seen her. The current was stronger than he anticipated, pulling him downstream even as he fought against it. His hand found fabric, her cloak, and he grasped it firmly, hauling her upward. Eleanor's eyes were closed, her lips already taking on a bluish tint. Alexander wrapped one arm around her chest, keeping her head above water as he kicked toward the shore. His legs felt like lead, the cold sapping his strength with terrifying efficiency. Each stroke required immense effort, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. The riverbank seemed impossibly far away. His feet finally found purchase on the rocky bottom. Alexander dragged Eleanor from the water, his arms shaking with exertion and cold. He laid her on the frozen ground, her body limp and unresponsive. Water streamed from her hair and clothing, forming small puddles that began to freeze almost immediately in the bitter air. Eleanor coughed violently, river water spilling from her mouth as her body convulsed. Her eyes opened, unfocused and filled with confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so violently that no coherent words emerged. Alexander quickly retrieved his discarded coat, draping it over her shivering form. "You are safe," he said, his own voice unsteady from cold and adrenaline. "Do not try to move yet." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She saw a man's face hovering above her, strong features, dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes filled with concern. His fine clothing, though soaked, marked him as someone of considerable means. She had never seen him before, yet he had saved her life. I fell," she managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "I witnessed it," Alexander replied, already assessing their situation. They were both dangerously cold, miles from the nearest house. His horse stood nearby, but Eleanor was in no condition to ride. He needed to get her warm immediately, or hypothermia would claim what the river had not. "Can you stand? We must reach shelter quickly." Eleanor tried to rise, but her legs would not support her weight. She collapsed back onto the frozen ground, frustration and fear warring in her expression. "I cannot. My legs." Alexander made his decision. He lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her waterlogged clothing. Eleanor's head lolled against his shoulder, her consciousness clearly wavering. He carried her to his horse, struggling to mount while holding her, his own strength fading rapidly. Finally seated, with Eleanor cradled against his chest, he turned the mare toward Ravenshire Manor. The ride took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Alexander focused on keeping Eleanor conscious, speaking to her in low, steady tones, even as his own body shook uncontrollably. She drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally murmuring responses that reassured him she still lived. Ravenshire Manor appeared through the fog like a salvation. 3 stories of grey stone, with dozens of windows reflecting the pale winter light. Alexander rode directly to the main entrance, something he had never done before. Servants rushed out at the commotion, their faces registering shock at the sight of their master soaked and shivering, carrying an unconscious woman. "Send for Dr. Morrison immediately," Alexander commanded, his voice hoarse but authoritative. "Prepare the blue guest chamber with hot water and warm blankets. Move quickly." The household erupted into organized chaos. Footmen rushed to assist, maids hurried to prepare the room, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, took charge of Eleanor's care with brisk efficiency. Alexander relinquished his burden reluctantly, watching as they carried Eleanor up the grand staircase before allowing himself to be led to his own chambers. As servants helped him from his frozen clothing, Alexander felt the reality of what had just occurred settle over him. He had risked his life for a complete stranger, acted without thought or hesitation in a way that was entirely unlike his usual measured approach to every situation. Yet he felt no regret, only a peculiar sense of connection to the woman he had pulled from the river, a woman whose name he did not even know. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar luxury. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to soft candlelight that cast dancing shadows across walls papered in delicate blue silk. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft, piled with quilts and blankets that cocooned her in warmth. For a moment, she wondered if she had died, and this was some unexpected afterlife. Then memory returned, the fall, the terrible cold, strong arms pulling her from darkness. She attempted to sit up, but her body protested with sharp pains. Her muscles ached as though she had been beaten, and her throat felt raw. A fire crackled in an ornate marble fireplace across the room, its heat a stark contrast to the cold that had nearly killed her. How much time had passed? Where was she? The door opened quietly, and a middle-aged woman in a housekeeper's black dress entered, carrying a tray. Mrs. Blackwood's severe features softened slightly when she saw Eleanor awake. "Good, you have returned to us. His Grace will be relieved. You gave us quite a fright, miss." His Grace. Eleanor's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "The Duke of Ravenshire," Mrs. Blackwood explained, setting the tray on a nearby table. "He is the gentleman who pulled you from the River Severn 2 days past. You have been unconscious most of that time, drifting in and out with fever. 2 days." Eleanor struggled to comprehend it. A duke had saved her life. She was lying in what must be his manor, being tended by his servants. The social distance between them was vast. She was merely a labourer's daughter, someone who worked with her hands and counted every penny. Dukes belonged to a different world entirely, one of inherited wealth and political power that shaped the nation itself. "I must leave," Eleanor said, attempting again to rise despite her weakness. "I have imposed enough. My family will be worried." "Your family has been notified," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted firmly, pressing Eleanor back against the pillows with surprising gentleness. "A messenger was sent to the village. Your mother knows you are safe and recovering. Dr. Morrison has insisted you remain here until your health is assured. You suffered severe exposure, Miss Hartwell. Moving you now could prove fatal." Eleanor subsided, overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. She glanced down and realized she was wearing a fine linen nightgown, certainly not her own. Someone had bathed her, dressed her, cared for her while she lay unconscious. The thought brought heat to her cheeks. "Mrs. Blackwood seemed to read her thoughts. "The upstairs maid, Sarah, attended to your needs. Everything has been proper, I assure you." A soft knock at the door preceded another visitor, Dr. Morrison, a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. He examined Eleanor with professional thoroughness, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, asking questions about pain and sensation. Finally, he nodded with satisfaction. "You are remarkably fortunate, Miss Hartwell," he pronounced. "Another few minutes in that water and we would not be having this conversation. His Grace's quick action saved your life. I have advised complete rest for at least another week. Your lungs show signs of inflammation, and you remain weak. Time and care will remedy both." After the doctor departed, Eleanor was left alone with her thoughts. Through the window, she could see manicured gardens dusted with snow, and beyond them, rolling parkland that stretched toward distant woods. This was a world she had only glimpsed from afar, never imagined she would inhabit, even temporarily. Below stairs, the servants' hall buzzed with speculation. The arrival of an unconscious commoner, rescued by the Duke himself, provided endless fuel for gossip. Sarah, who had been tasked with Eleanor's care, defended her charge against the more pointed remarks. "She seems a decent sort," Sarah insisted as she helped polish silver in the servants' hall. "Well spoken when she is conscious. Her hands show she is accustomed to work, not idleness." "That is precisely the problem," sniffed Margaret, one of the older housemaids. "What was His Grace thinking, bringing such a person here? The scandal when word reaches London." "He saved her life," interjected Thomas, a young footman. "Would you have him leave her to drown? What kind of gentleman would that make him?" The housekeeper's presence silenced further debate, but the questions remained. In the drawing-room, Alexander's mother, the Dowager Duchess Catherine, expressed her concerns more directly. She sat in a high-backed chair, upholstered in burgundy velvet, her posture rigidly perfect, her expression one of controlled disapproval. "You cannot keep this girl here indefinitely," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "The situation is highly irregular. People will talk, Alexander. They already are." Alexander stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the winter landscape. He had recovered physically from his ordeal, though he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the woman recovering upstairs. "Let them talk," I will not send her away until she is well enough to leave safely. What would you have me do, Mother? Turn her out to satisfy gossip? I would have you consider your position, Catherine replied sharply. You have responsibilities. To your name, your estate, your future. This act of heroism, while admirable, was also impulsive. That is not like you. Alexander turned from the window, meeting his mother's gaze steadily. Perhaps it should be more like me. I have spent my entire life calculating every action, weighing every decision against how it might appear. For once, I acted purely on instinct, and I saved a life. I cannot regret that. The Dowager Duchess sighed, her stern expression softening slightly. I know your heart is good, my son, but the world judges harshly, particularly those in our position. This girl's presence here will be misinterpreted. Already, I have received 3 letters from concerned friends in the county, delicately inquiring about the situation. Then I will address those concerns directly, Alexander said. Miss Hartwell is a guest under my protection, nothing more. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. A news spread through the village with predictable speed. Eleanor's mother, Margaret Hartwell, a widow who supported herself and her daughter through needlework, faced a barrage of questions from neighbours. Some expressed genuine concern and relief at Eleanor's survival. Others hinted at scandal, their words carefully chosen but their meaning clear. Must be quite comfortable up at the manor, commented Mrs. Finch, the baker's wife, as she purchased ribbon at the village shop. All that luxury. One could get accustomed to it, I imagine. Margaret kept her composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she selected thread. My daughter nearly died. I am grateful to His Grace for his intervention and care. Nothing more should be read into it. At the local tavern, speculation took a more direct form. Men who had never exchanged more than a greeting with the Duke of Ravenshire debated his motives over pints of ale. Some saw genuine heroism, others suspected less honourable intentions. The presence of class divisions coloured every interpretation, making simple rescue into something complex and suspect. Back at the manor, Eleanor grew stronger each day. On the 4th day of her residence, she felt well enough to sit in a chair by the window, wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown. She watched the household's rhythms, servants crossing the courtyard, groundskeepers tending to winter tasks, the smoke rising from multiple chimneys into the grey sky. A knock at her door was followed by Sarah's cheerful face. His Grace requests permission to visit, miss. He wishes to inquire about your health. Eleanor's heart raced unexpectedly. She had not seen the Duke since that terrible day by the river, knew him only as a blurred figure in her fragmented memories. Yes, of course. Please tell him he is welcome. Alexander entered moments later, and Eleanor was struck by her first clear view of her rescuer. He was tall, with dark hair and grey eyes that held both intelligence and something else, perhaps loneliness or weariness. His clothing was impeccable but understated, his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority, yet carrying it without arrogance. Miss Hartwell, he said, his voice the same one that had spoken reassurance as he carried her to safety. I am glad to see you recovering. Doctor, Morrison reports excellent progress. Your Grace, Eleanor replied, managing a small curtsy despite her weakness. I owe you my life. Words cannot express my gratitude. No gratitude is necessary, Alexander said, his expression earnest. Any gentleman would have done the same. Eleanor met his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. Perhaps any gentleman should, but in my experience, not all would. You risked yourself for a stranger. That is nobility of character, not merely title. Her words clearly affected him. Alexander was silent for a moment before responding. You give me too much credit. I acted on instinct, nothing more. Instinct reveals character, Eleanor countered gently. A person's truest self emerges in crisis, when there is no time for pretense. Their conversation continued, tentative but genuine. Alexander found himself drawn to Eleanor's directness, so different from the calculated speech of his usual social circle. She spoke plainly, her intelligence evident despite her limited formal education. Eleanor, in turn, discovered that the Duke was more thoughtful and less imperious than she had imagined someone of his rank would be. When Alexander finally took his leave, promising to visit again if she felt well enough for company, Eleanor was left with a peculiar mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more complicated, an unexpected connection to someone whose world was entirely different from her own. She told herself it was merely the natural bond between rescuer and rescued, nothing that would persist once she returned to her normal life. Yet she could not quite convince herself that was all it was. By the end of the first week, Eleanor was strong enough to take brief walks within the manor, always chaperoned by Sarah. The house was magnificent beyond anything she had imagined, rooms filled with paintings by masters, furniture crafted by artisans, carpets imported from distant lands. Each detail spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, a stark reminder of the gulf between her circumstances and those of her host. On a crisp morning, Eleanor descended the main staircase carefully, still conscious of her lingering weakness. She had been granted permission to explore the library, and the prospect delighted her. Books had always been a luxury in her life, borrowed occasionally from the vicar or read in precious stolen moments. The library at Ravenshire Manor occupied 2 floors, connected by a spiral staircase, with thousands of volumes lining mahogany shelves. Eleanor stood in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The scent of leather and old paper enveloped her like an embrace. Impressive, is it not? Alexander's voice came from a wing-backed chair near the fireplace. He had been reading, but now he set his book aside, rising to greet her. My grandfather was an avid collector. These represent 50 years of acquisition. It is extraordinary, Eleanor breathed, stepping inside. Her fingers traced the spine of a nearby volume reverently. I could spend a lifetime here and not read them all. You are welcome to try, for as long as you remain with us, Alexander offered with a slight smile. Though I hope that will not require a lifetime. Comfortable as we try to make you, I am certain you are eager to return home. Eleanor hesitated. The truth was more complicated. She did miss her mother, missed the simplicity of her former life. Yet she also recognized that her time here had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never considered. Conversations with Alexander had revealed shared interests. A love of poetry, curiosity about natural philosophy, appreciation for music. Such intellectual companionship had been rare in her village existence. I am grateful for your hospitality, she said carefully, but I am also conscious of the burden my presence places upon your household. Alexander frowned slightly. You are no burden, though I confess others do not share my view. My mother, for instance, grows increasingly concerned about propriety and reputation. As if summoned by mention, the Dowager Duchess appeared in the doorway. Catherine's expression tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw Eleanor and her son together, unchaperoned, despite the public nature of the library. Alexander, a word, please. In private. Alexander excused himself, following his mother to the adjoining study. Their voices, though lowered, carried through the partially open door. Eleanor tried not to listen, but the Dowager's words were forceful enough to be unavoidable. This has gone too far, Catherine insisted. The girl has recovered sufficiently to be moved. Her presence here fuels increasingly unpleasant speculation. Lord Pemberton called yesterday, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, but his true purpose was to probe regarding your intentions toward this Eleanor Hartwell. My intentions are entirely honorable, Alexander replied, his voice tight with controlled frustration. I have no intentions beyond ensuring her complete recovery. Then you are naive about how society interprets such situations, Catherine countered. You spend time with her daily. You have given her access to our private spaces. People observe, Alexander. They draw conclusions. And those conclusions will affect not only your reputation but hers. The girl will be unmarriageable after this, presumed to be your mistress, whether or not the accusation has any foundation. Eleanor felt as though she had been struck. The casual cruelty of the assessment, that her reputation could be destroyed simply by proximity to her rescuer, was staggering. She had been foolish to forget, even briefly, the rigid social hierarchies that governed this world. A duke and a commoner could not simply be friends. Every interaction would be viewed through the lens of class and suspicion. She retreated from the library quickly, her earlier pleasure in the day completely evaporated. Sarah found her in her room an hour later, staring out the window with unseeing eyes. "Miss, are you unwell? Shall I fetch Dr. Morrison?" "No," Eleanor said quietly, "but please ask Mrs. Blackwood to arrange transport to the village. I will be leaving tomorrow." Sarah's eyes widened. "But Dr. Morrison has not yet given his consent." "I am well enough," Eleanor interrupted, her tone firmer than she felt. "I have imposed long enough. Please make the arrangements." News of Eleanor's impending departure reached Alexander through the household network. He found her in the garden that afternoon, bundled against the cold, sitting on a stone bench among the dormant rose bushes. Her profile was sad, her usual animation dimmed. "Sarah tells me you plan to leave tomorrow," he said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside her. "May I ask why the sudden decision?" Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "I have recovered my health. It is time I returned to my proper place." "Your proper place," Alexander repeated, and Eleanor heard something like anger in his voice. "Is that how you see it? Your recovery is convenient timing for removing an inconvenience." That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Alexander demanded, turning to face her fully. "Because I suspect this decision has less to do with your health and more to do with something you overheard. My mother's concerns, perhaps." Eleanor finally met his eyes, her own reflecting a mix of sadness and resignation. "Your mother is right. My presence here damages both our reputations. I should never have stayed this long. The kindness you have shown me has been extraordinary, but it cannot continue without consequences. People are talking, making assumptions. I will not be the cause of scandal for you." "And what of the scandal for you?" Alexander asked quietly. "My mother suggested you would be thought my mistress, regardless of the truth. Does that not concern you?" "Of course it concerns me," Eleanor admitted, her voice breaking slightly, "but the damage is likely done already. The sooner I leave, the sooner the gossip will fade. People have short memories when not continually fed new material." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, as he struggled with emotions Eleanor could not quite read. "I do not want you to go," he finally said, the admission clearly difficult for him. "These past days, our conversations, they have been the most genuine interactions I have experienced in years. Everyone else speaks to my title, carefully moderating their words. You speak to me as a person. That is remarkably rare in my life." Eleanor felt tears threatening and fought them back. "I value our friendship as well. But friendship between us is not possible in the eyes of society. You know this as well as I do." "Society is often wrong," Alexander said with sudden intensity. "Its rules are arbitrary, designed to maintain power structures that benefit the few at the expense of the many. Why should I respect judgments from people who value birth over character? Because you must live in that world. Eleanor replied gently. "You are a duke with responsibilities to your family, your estates, your position. I am no one, the daughter of a labourer, now deceased, and a seamstress. The distance between us is not just social convention. It is the reality of our lives." "It does not have to be." Alexander's words hung in the cold air, laden with implications neither could fully address. Eleanor stood, needing distance before this conversation ventured into territory that would make everything more painful. "I will leave tomorrow, as planned. Please, let us part as friends, with my gratitude and your knowledge that you saved a life that day. That is enough. It must be enough." She walked back toward the house, her stride purposeful despite the tears that finally escaped. Alexander remained on the bench, watching her go, his hands clenched into fists of frustration at his sides. That evening, Thomas the footman sought out Alexander in his study. The young man was clearly nervous about approaching the Duke directly, but his sense of loyalty overrode his apprehension. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but there is something you should know about Miss Hartwell." Alexander looked up from correspondence he had been pretending to read. "Go on." "The village talk, sir. It has grown ugly. Some are saying, well, they are suggesting Miss Hartwell has taken advantage of the situation, that she fell on purpose to gain your attention and charity." Thomas's face flushed with anger at the injustice. "It is lies, Your Grace. I have seen how she is. Modest and grateful, never presuming, but lies spread faster than truth." Alexander's expression darkened. "Who is spreading these rumors?" "Difficult to say where they began, sir, but they have reached the point where Miss Hartwell's mother has faced harassment. Someone threw mud at their cottage door, left a note calling her daughter unpleasant names." Rage filled Alexander, cold and focused. That Eleanor should be punished for his act of rescue, blamed for circumstances entirely beyond her control, was intolerable. Yet his intervention would likely only worsen her situation. A duke's defense would be interpreted as confirmation of an improper relationship. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Thomas," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "You may go." Alone again, Alexander wrestled with an impossible situation. His every instinct demanded he protect Eleanor, defend her publicly, ensure she faced no consequences for his actions. But doing so would destroy her more thoroughly than any rumor. The cruel irony was not lost on him. The social system that granted him wealth and power also circumscribed his ability to use them for genuine good. In her room, Eleanor packed the few belongings that belonged to her, her repaired dress, her boots, the basket that had been rescued from the riverside. Everything else in this room, every comfort she had enjoyed, belonged to a world she was about to leave behind. She told herself it was for the best, that she would soon resume her normal life, and this interlude would fade into memory. But as she lay in the comfortable bed for the last time, staring at the embroidered canopy above her, Eleanor knew that nothing would truly be the same. She had glimpsed another way of living, had connected with someone whose mind matched her own, had been treated with a respect and consideration she had never before experienced. Returning to her previous existence would feel like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly, possible but never quite comfortable again. Tomorrow, she would leave. Tonight, she allowed herself to acknowledge what could never be spoken aloud, that she had developed feelings for the Duke of Ravenshire that extended well beyond gratitude, feelings that were entirely inappropriate, completely impossible, and absolutely real.